Christmas morning, 1945. Fayetteville, West Virginia. A place where Sodder family's house used to stand. There's nothing, just a smoking hole in the ground. A basement full of ash. 5 children were inside that house when it caught fire. Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 10, Jennie, 8, and Betty, 5. When the firefighters finally arrive, 7 hours after the fire starts, they shift through the rubble expecting to find something. Remains, teeth, something. They find nothing. Not a tooth, not bones, not a trace of 5 human beings. The fire chief said the place was hot enough that it would have completely cremated them. But so hot that 5 children simply ceased to exist. But here's the thing. A coal furnace survived that fire. An iron stove survived. Household appliances still recognizable in the ash. Metal and machinery endured what 5 children's skeletons could not. And that contradiction, that impossible, maddening contradiction, is what kept this family searching for answers even after 44 years. This is Beyond the Case, and once you hear the full story, you'll never see it the same way again. Before we continue, subscribe. But to understand how 5 children vanished on Christmas Eve, we need to go back to the family, back to the town, back to the things that happened the week before the fire. The things, at the time, nobody connected. George Soddu was born Giorgio Soddu in 1895 on the island of Sardinia, Italy. He came to America when he was 13 years old with his older brother. He worked the railroads in Pennsylvania, hold water, hold supplies. It did whatever it took. After some time, he moved to West Virginia and started a trucking company and began hauling coal out of the mines which powered the region. He married Jennie, another Italian immigrant, storekeeper's daughter. They settled outside of Fayetteville in a 2-story timber frame house. Fayetteville had a big Italian-American community. It felt like home. George and Jennie had 10 children. 10. Their house was always loud, full of life. By all accounts, they were one of the most well-respected working-class families in the area. George's trucking business was thriving. Jennie kept the household running like clockwork. All children were happy, healthy, and close. But George had a quality that not everyone appreciated. He was outspoken, blunt. He had opinions and he didn't keep them to himself. In the early 1940s, an opinion started making him enemies. George Soddu fiercely opposed Benito Mussolini. Now, that might sound like an unremarkable position. Mussolini was a fascist dictator. But in parts of the Italian-American community in West Virginia, this wasn't a popular stance. Some immigrants still had loyalty to the old country. Some had ties that ran deeper than politics. George's vocal criticism made certain people very uncomfortable. In October 1945, 2 months before Christmas, an insurance salesman came to the Sodder house. George turned him down. The salesman got angry. He said some things that George would replay for the rest of his life. He said it was because of the dirty remarks we've been making about Mussolini. George brushed it off. People said things, that's just how it was. But there were other signs. A stranger around the same time showed up at the house, looking for some hauling work. He wandered to the back of the property, looked at 2 fuse boxes and said, "This is going to cause fire someday." George thought it was a strange thing to say. It just had his house rewired 2 months ago. The local power company had inspected it and said everything was fine. And in the weeks before Christmas, George's older sons noticed something else. A car parked along the main highway through town. Its occupants sitting inside, watching the younger Sodder children as they walked home from school. Nobody connected these things yet, not yet, but they would. December 24th, 1945, the day of the Christmas Eve. The Sodder household was buzzing. 9 out of the 10 children were already home. The eldest son, Joe, had just been discharged from the army the day before and wasn't home yet. George and 2 of his older sons, John and George Jr., spent the day holding coal. They were exhausted. They went to bed early. The younger children had a different plan. The 17-year-old daughter, Marion, had bought them Christmas presents from the time store where she worked, little toys to keep them busy. The young ones were too excited to sleep. Jennie, their mother, told them they could stay up late. She carried 2-year-old Sylvia to bed around 10:30, reminding Maurice and Louis to feed the cows and close the chicken coop before they come in. The 5 children stayed up playing. Marion fell asleep on the couch with a magazine. The radio was on, the house was warm, Christmas lights glowed on the tree. It was a perfectly ordinary Christmas Eve. Around midnight, the phone rang. Jennie picked up. A woman's voice on the other end asked Jennie about someone Jennie didn't recognize. Obviously, wrong number. But in the background, Jennie could hear laughter, clinking glasses, the sounds of a party. The woman hung up with what Jennie would later describe as a strange laugh. Jennie noticed the lights were still on downstairs. The front door was unlocked. She went down, turned off the lights, locked the door, and went back to bed. About 30 minutes later, she heard a sound on the roof, a third, then something rolling across the surface and falling to the ground, a thump. She didn't think much of it. She thought it was a branch, maybe even an animal. She went back to sleep. That was the last moment of normal the Sodder family would ever know. At approximately 1 a.m., Jennie jolted awake. Thick smoke was pouring into the bedroom. She opened the door and saw flames in George's office, already climbing the walls. Jennie screamed for George. George was up in seconds. Marion, who had been asleep on the couch, took baby Sylvia and got out of the house. John and George Jr. also made it out of their attic bedrooms. Jennie and George also got out. But the younger children who were upstairs didn't come down. George tried to go back in. He broke a window with his bare hand, slicing his arm open. He climbed onto the living room, but the fire blocked the access to the stairway. He couldn't reach them. He ran back outside. The ladder. There was always a ladder leaning against the house. It was gone. George tried another plan. He called trucks. If he could pull one against the house, he could stand on the roof and reach the second floor windows. He ran to the trucks, turned the key over in the first one. It wouldn't start. Second truck. Same thing. Both had been running perfectly hours earlier. Neither of them would turn over. Marion ran to the neighbor's house to call the fire department. She picked up the phone. No operator answered. A nearby neighbor who saw the blaze tried calling from a nearby tavern. Still, no response. Finally, someone drove into the town and tracked down Fire Chief F.J. Maurice in person. The fire department was 2.5 miles away, but they didn't arrive until 8 a.m., 7 hours after the fire had started. The chief later offered an explanation for the delay. He said it didn't know how to drive. He had been fire chief for 8 years. By the time anyone with a hose arrived, the Sodder home had already been burning for 45 minutes. There was nothing left, just a basement full of smoldering ash. George and Jennie stood in the freezing morning of Christmas. They were looking at what used to be their house. Marion, George Jr., John, and Sylvia, safe. But the younger ones, gone. On Christmas Day, the firefighters did a brief search through the ash. Chief Maurice told the parents he found no remains, no bones, nothing. He said the fire had been hot enough to completely cremate 5 children. The state police inspector arrived, looked at the scene, and ruled the fire as an accident, faulty wiring. The coroner's office issued 5 death certificates before the New Year. Case closed, Merry Christmas. And the Sodder family couldn't accept it. And when they started looking, really looking at what happened that night, the official story didn't just fall apart, it disintegrated. Start with the fire itself. If it was caused by faulty wiring, power should have gone out. But the Christmas lights were still on in the early stages of the blaze. Jennie saw them. Electricity was still flowing. That's not what happens in an electrical fire. And then the phone line. A telephone repairman later looked at the line to the Sodder house. It hadn't been burned through in the fire. It had been cut deliberately by someone who had climbed up 14 feet up a utility pole to do it. A man was later identified and arrested. He admitted he'd cut the line while stealing from the Sodder's property in the fire. He claimed he thought it was a power line. He denied any involvement in setting the fire. He was released. No further investigation? The ladder. George found it days later at the bottom of an embankment, 75 feet away from where it always stood. Someone had moved it just before the fire. And then there's the question of the remains, or rather, the complete absence of the remains. Jennie Sodder couldn't let this go. She contacted a crematorium in Ohio. She asked a simple question: what happens to a human body in extreme heat? The employee told her that even after 2 hours in 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, bones of significant size remained. Always. The house had burned for 45 minutes at a temperature far lower than an industrial crematorium. Appliances survived, furnace survived, 5 skeletons did not. Jennie started burning animal bones in her backyard. Chicken bones, pork bones. She burned them for hours, and every single time, the bones survived. Charred, yes, but there. In 1949, the family brought in a pathologist from Washington, D.C. to conduct a proper excavation of the site. They dug through everything. What they found was strange. Partially damaged coins, a partially burned dictionary, and 4 small fragments of human vertebrae. The pathologist sent the fragments to the Smithsonian Institution. The analysis came back. The vertebrae belonged to a single individual, between 16 and 22 years old at the time of death. The oldest Sodder child, Maurice, was 14 years old. The bones showed no evidence of exposure to fire, but one line in the Smithsonian report still echoes decades later. It is very strange that no other bones were found. One would expect to find full skeletons of 5 children rather than just 4 vertebrae. The vertebrae almost certainly came from the filled dirt George had bulldozed over the site 4 days after the fire. Not from the children, not from the blaze. But here's where the story gets stranger. The fire chief, F.J. Maurice. 2 years later, word got around at Fayetteville that Maurice actually found something in the rubble on the Christmas morning. A human heart, he said. He buried it in a dynamite box and sealed it. He never told the family. When the Sodders demanded he show them, they dug up the box, took what was inside to a funeral director. The funeral director identified it as a beef liver, fresh, with no signs of fire damage. Maurice later admitted that he'd planted it. He said he'd done it hoping the family would stop looking. Think about that. A fire chief fabricating evidence to stop grieving parents looking for their children. And there were witnesses. A woman at a tourist spot between Fayetteville and Charleston said she served 5 children, matching the Sodder's description, breakfast the morning after the fire. A woman working in a hotel in Charleston later told the police that she'd see 4 out of the 5 Sodder children, accompanied by 2 women, 2 men, whom she later described as hostile and controlling. The children were frightened. And then there's the private investigators the Sodders hired. He uncovered something remarkable. The insurance salesman who had threatened George 2 months before the fire, "Your house will go up in smoke and your children will be destroyed," had been seated on a coroner's jury, the same jury that ruled the fire as accidental. The Sodders wrote to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. begging for help. Hoover personally responded to them, saying the case didn't fall under federal jurisdiction but offered to assist if the local authorities requested it. The local authorities declined it. The Sodders never stopped looking. In 1952, they put up a billboard on Route 16 where their house had stood. 5 children, 5 faces. A reward of 5,000 later raised to 10,000 for any information. Below the photos, a question that thousands of passing drivers would read over and over. What was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Or are they still alive? For years, people would pull off the highway, walk up to that billboard, stand there, look at the faces of those children, and wonder. Then, in 1968, 23 years after the fire, Jennie received a letter. No return address, Kentucky postmark. Inside was a photograph of a man, maybe in his mid-20s. He looked strikingly like an adult version of the 9-year-old Louis Sodder. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie, A90132 or 35. But none of the Sodder children was named Frankie. The number and combination of the letter has never been decoded. The handwriting on the letter has never been identified. George and Jennie immediately hired a private investigator and sent him to Kentucky to find the source of the letter. He disappeared and never contacted them again. The family updated the billboard with the man who might be Louis and the new text. It is not too late after 30 years to still investigate. So what happened? The honest answer, nobody knows. But there are theories ranging from tragic to chilling. Theory 1. The children died in the fire. Investigation was botched. Fire department arrived 7 hours late. George bulldozed the scene 4 days after the fire. Whatever remains existed were lost to incompetence, not conspiracy. This is the simplest explanation. But it requires you to believe that 45 minutes of fire did what 2 hours at 2000 degrees at a crematorium cannot. It also requires you to ignore the witnesses who saw the Sodder children the next morning after the fire. Theory 2. Arson and kidnapping. Someone set the fire as a distraction or maybe used as a cover to take the children. The threats tied to George's anti-Mussolini stance. Possible mafia connections. The sabotage ladder, their drugs, the cut phone line. The fire wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to provide chaos while someone took 5 children out the front door in the middle of the night. The witnesses at the tourist spot and the Charleston Hotel support this, but no ransom demand ever came, and no evidence of organized crime ever surfaced. Theory 3. Local corruption and cover-up. Fire department arriving 7 hours late. The insurance salesman on the coroner's jury, and the fire chief planting fake evidence, and the local authorities refusing FBI assistance. Whether the children died or were taken, someone in Fayetteville didn't want the truth found out. The official response from the fire chief to the state police was designed to bury the case, not solve it. George Soddu died in 1969. He spent the last 24 years of his life chasing leads, driving across the country on tips, writing letters to the FBI, staring at that billboard. He never found out what happened to his children. Jennie tended the memorial garden on the site of their home for the rest of her life. She kept growing flowers where the house had been. She died in 1989. The surviving Sodder children took down the old weathered billboard shortly after. It had stood almost for 40 years. Sylvia Sodder, the youngest surviving child. She was 2 years old at the time of the fire. She said it was her earliest memory. For her entire life, she kept promising her parents that she would never stop looking, that she would keep the story alive. Sylvia died in 2021. She was the last of the Sodder children. She never found out what happened to her siblings. If you believe stories like this deserve careful and honest telling, consider subscribing to Beyond the Case. It's a small thing, but it helps us keep these forgotten cases alive. I keep coming to that billboard. 5 faces, 5 children. We're playing with Christmas present one moment and gone the next. A question that hung over West Virginia for over 4 decades, asked by the grieving parents who refused to believe in anything they'd been told. What was their fate? 8 years later, no one has answered. And till this day, no one knows.